Hey guys, welcome back to The Secret Deciphered. Today we're going to study a little bit in the Secret a Treasure Hunt book of the fairy, the Handy Manticore. And so, Handy Manticore, Handy Manticort, however it gets spelled sometimes, is a very interesting fairy. And so, being that this is the July painting month, it's worth a mention of the Manticore. And if you turn to your page, I think it's 82 in everybody's book, but we have the Handy Manticore here. And you notice in the picture that Ben has taken this photograph of this fairy that it resembles kind of a little bit like a lion. It's kind of hard to see because I know it's black and white. But I wanted to really kind of expound on why this particular page should also be considered if you're looking for potentially a Arabian slash Persian slash Indian gemstone. And so oftentimes people look at this page and they read about it and they read under the history where it says from the depths of the Black Forest, where the manufacture of slippers that forced people to dance till they dropped was a cottage industry. Handy Manticore made his way to the shores not long ago by means of a steam-powered, radio-controlled, 26,000-piece, 1/32nd scale model raft. And you know, I always say that we need to look at the history sections of each of the fairies because they give a lot of insight. But particularly for the Manticore, this is really kind of an interesting take here. So when it says the Black Forest, that's a presumption that that's in Germany. And then, of course, the manufacture of slippers that forced people to dance till they dropped. So that is a direct pun or connection to Rumpelstiltskin. And so I really want this to be studied in the vein that sometimes Byron will say these things and say this is where the creature is from, but the origination actually is elsewhere. So the Manticore itself is essentially a mythological being that was kind of created and or somewhat related to the Egyptian Sphinx out of Persia. And so it kind of proliferated into Western European medieval art. And so when we look at the actual body of a manticore, so you have like what's a human face with a lion's mane, the lion's body, plus the lion's feet, and a scorpion type scaled tail. And of course, I'm sure you can Google it and look up some of these pictures of what a manticore actually looks like. But the term, it says it's a transliteration on old Persian compound words. And so the ultimate source of a manticore was Tzetzes. And so he was a Greek physician of the Persian court during the Achaemenid dynasty. And so it's important to understand where this creature kind of came from. So now that we are pulling it back to Old Persia, we can look. I mean, Tzetzes wrote about him, wrote the name in Persian, it's translated in Greek. The name was mistranscribed as Manticorus in a faulty copy of Aristotle, through whose works the notion of the manticore was perpetuated across Europe. So that's kind of where it got its feed into Black Forest area, or what was the early part of Germany, right? early um, European area there. And so what's important to note is throughout the book, when he is talking about, when I say he, I mean Byron, at the beginning, the carpet weaving techniques, the magic carpet, he's describing the carpet weaving techniques at the very beginning of the book. And then when you go under spotter's tips under the handy Manticore, and you'll see he makes mention here of disintegrating quilts, along other things as well. Collapsing furniture, raw bread, an unfinished life-sized paint by numbers version of Guernica, disintegrating quilts, 1/3 of a yacht in the attic, unraveling turtlenecks, a snaggletooth patio, crooked wallpaper, and lumpy vases. If you can find a man with wood shavings in his hair, an incorrectly buttoned shop apron, and charcoal where his eyebrows used to be, ask him where to find the handy Manticore. In all likelihood, he will point you in the right direction with his blue, swollen, throbbing thumb. And I know I've made the mention of the throbbing thumb before in the Facebook group, and we talk about that could be a direct connection to Edgar Allan Poe, describing how after he had, killed the old man and tried to get rid of him in the Telltale Heart, that his thumb was throbbing and swollen. And so it's interesting. Byron almost peppers different writers throughout the entire book. I mean, if we look at who wrote about the Manticore in German history, then we have to go to, I want to say, Hein. What is his name? Heinrich Heine. And so he, there's mention as a possibility that he was mentioning the Manticore as one of the creatures that inhabit the Black Forest in his writing. And of course, he's a German writer. And so then you go, well, wait a minute. You're going German. First, we started Persian. But that's kind of the twist in the book. I mean, Byron is really peppering a lot of different writers, a lot of different cultures, with main overtones for the main ones that he's trying to make a point with. And so when you look at the habits of the handy Manticore, and it says that the handy Andy is an unselfish fellow, having inspired a mortal to attempt domestic arts and crafts, he often turns his victims over into the waiting area of another malevolent spirit, the garden goyle, the saucier's apprentice, or the household unfamiliars. So there, this is where it gets kind of tricky too, because if you go to Garden Goyle and talks about the Sahara Desert and in these areas of essentially Africa, Ethiopia, let's throw in some pop culture here from the 80s. There's a great massive famine going on in North Africa, Ethiopia. Again, we had the song We Are the World that came out around like 1983. So Byron's bearing these casks and writing these things as this is happening and making reference to these areas of the world. And we know Byron loves children. We know loved children. We know that he has his, we have the Byron Price Children's Fund, his great care of trying to educate children and care for them is, a living legacy for him. And so, anyways, I digress and we'll go back. Handy Manticore. Also, Manticores are very popular in Japan, and we know that there is the Japanese version of the secret book that was translated, and so Manticore they do anime and make the little pictures of these manticores. Oftentimes the name itself can be translated to elf, in Japanese. And so, and that's what it is, kind of it's translated into Japanese elf in the Japanese edition. And so, what are we to glean from this? What are we to glean from some of the things that he suggests under the history? And there's quite a chunk of history. I mean, when he goes on and he says, as his name suggests, Handy Manty has many relatives. He goes into Humpty Dumpty, Steeplejacks, Tutti Frutti, Fuzzy Wuzzy, Ricky Rooey, Harum Scarum. Harum Scarum, because that's Persian, has a Persian connotation to it, because then it turns around and says, who presides over the installation of Arabian burglar alarms. And so you get the sense, and by the way, you think, well, why would Byron write all of this goofy stuff? Like, why are you mentioning Ricky Rooey and all of these things? And so when we really take each word and break it down, we have Humpty Dumpty. We know that's a nonsense rhyme about a character who falls off a wall and breaks into pieces. We know the steeplejack is a nonsense word. It's used to describe someone who's climbing steeples. Tutti Frutti describes a variety of fruits. It's a nonsense phrase. Fuzzy Wuzzy, a nonsense phrase, describes someone who is covered in fur. Ricky Rooey, the nonsense phrase that describes someone who is always running around. I can attest to that. Harum Scarum, nonsense phrase that's used to describe someone who is reckless and careless. And okie dokie at the end. Also a nonsense phrase that's used to express agreement or approval, because we know, you're going to go to the store, will you grab that for me? Okie dokie. And so, the approval phrase. But all of these phrases, all of these things are nonsense phrases. And you say, well, oh, the book is just filler, some groups say. It's not important. Well, these instances are important, because Byron is teaching us that these are nonsense words and phrases that are often used in wordplay. Wordplay such as puns, riddles, tongue twisters, they all hold a little bit of a clue. And so it's up to us, obviously, to decide where these clues will lead us. But when we go into the spotter's tips, and it's really kind of talking about a lot of destruction, a lot of things that are falling apart. And we know, based on the pun of this fairy, Handy Manticort, handyman, do it yourself, why spend the money and then you screw everything up and then it costs twice as much to fix it, right? So that's kind of another pun on the fairy himself, but he has a deeper meaning of where this folklore and mythology comes from. And so when we look at, we go back in classic literature, there's different accounts of the Manticore. I think it's it's Setzia's lost book of Indica, or India. And it was circulated among the Greek writers, like Photius, Pliny the Elder, Aullian, or Aullian. And so we have these other writers who have talked about this kind of creature. And what's most important to understand about the original Manticore, and not the European Manticore that had become, kind of a destructive, horrid creature, is that the Manticore itself was the guardian of treasure. So when we think about Handy Manticore and his vast array of double meanings and connections to some other fairies, these other fairies we have to take a look at, because it says here, he hands the victims over to other malevolent spirits. It doesn't say benevolent. And so we have to look at these other fairies for the same kinds of clues to what these creatures are and where they come from. Because if we can figure out where they come from, truly, reading through the nonsense, there's a good possibility you can find some treasure. So, with that, hope you're having a super week. Check back in with me for another fairy study. We will be doing all of them through the book, as we always do, deciphering, decoding, thinking, learning, creating theories. Remember, it's okay to have more than one theory. It's okay to have more than one city in your mind. That's what Byron wanted. He wasn't expecting people to have Google today and work on a puzzle that's 8 states away. He wrote these puzzles more specifically to the areas they're buried. And so therefore, it's going to be really important to study the book and study the fairies and study the wordplay that he's used to get you there. I hope you have a great week, and we will circle back up for the next one. I think maybe we'll go into garden goyle. That's a real interesting one for Africa. All right, fairy on, kids.